Welcome you to another edition of African Complementary and Alternative Medicine, Africam on Impact Africa Television. Today, what we'll be looking at is what people call Efori Tuulu, which is known as migraine, headache, and migraine. Well, research has shown us from University College Hospital here in Ibadan that there are over 1.5 million cases of reported migraine each year. But looking at how we can use alternative medicine to treat migraine, this afternoon, I have with me on set Mrs. Christiana Olapade Ojo, a clinical herbalist and the managing director of Nurse Specialist Clinic. I welcome you to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, to start with the several cases of migraine that we have in the country, 1.5 over 1.5 million cases that are being reported. We don't know of those that are not being reported. Well, that shows that migraine is something that we need to actually focus on and talk about using traditional medicine and how we can actually help our people to get to manage it. To start with, at what point do we know that someone is having headache or migraine?
Unfortunately, the diagnosis of pain is not something that can be quantitatively measured. Like, when you take blood sample and say that, okay, how much pain is in this person's body. It is basically the only way we can diagnose is by verbal report of that person. And then in some cases where there is fever, when the temperature is elevated. So it is only based on the person's report. I'm very aware, for instance, that there are cases of children who suffer migraine, maybe as a result of eyesight problem. But for instance, if a child is not living with their biological parents and they keep saying, oh, auntie, I have a headache, uncle, I have a headache, our culture, we are quite careless when it comes to children health. And then we'll go like, oh, you are just being lazy, go and read your book. Oh, you are just being lazy, go and do your housework. Whereas that child is already going through what we know as migraine, maybe as a result of some physiological changes in the eyes or maybe hereditary issues with the child's eyes. So diagnosis of headache, as it were, is basically based on the subject, on the affected person's report. To now say, okay, I think I am feeling this. And then, clinically, we could document it and find out what could be responsible for it, as in secondary headache, or maybe if there is nothing responsible for it. There are so many things that causes headache.
When it comes to so many things that causes headache, because when we look at the symptoms of most ailments, of most illness that people complain about, headache is one of the foundational symptoms.
Traditionally, we actually say that headache is the loudest way that our body tries to communicate with us. But unfortunately, a lot of us just ignore that cry for help. The moment you are having headache, you're supposed to leave whatever you're doing and answer your body's call. Because that means your body is telling you something.
Headache is predominantly one of the major signals that one should be on the lookout for. Now, when we talk of headache and migraine, when someone is having migraine, what are these symptoms? How will it be projected to someone beside that, okay, this person might actually be suffering from migraine?
Majorly, the difference between a regular headache, there are 4 different types of headache. We have the cluster headache, we have the sinus headache, we have another one, and then migraine. 4 different types. The difference between migraine and the other 3 is that migraine happens on one side of the head. I think sinus headache also happens on the eye, but not on the entire side of the head. For migraine, it happens from half, maybe not necessarily half part of the skull, but that side of the temple. It affects the eardrums. It sometimes affects the neck as well, and then it causes sensitivity to light. When someone has migraine headache, you find out that that person cannot stand bright light. The person cannot stand loud noise, at that moment. And then there is the issue of nausea as well. The person feels like vomiting. Sometimes there may not be temperature. If there is no infection, the person may not have temperature. But if there's an infection, the person may have temperature. But the major sign of migraine is that it happens on one side of the head, including the eardrums, the eyes, and a major part of the neck and the head. And then it comes with nausea. It comes with high sensitivity to light and basically discomfort.
Now, this point that we had, that we have been able to identify the difference between headache and migraine uh, happening to one side
Of the head.
of the head.
Yes.
Now, clinically, there are treatments to migraine, but migraine seems to be something that it can only be managed. And over time, there is a way that we can actually say, okay, this is how we can get to treat migraine,
Migraine.
even traditionally. How do we address the treatment of migraine?
Traditionally, there are managements, and I'm always careful with the word cure anyway, because even with migraine, there is a lot of evidence that points to the fact, traditionally as well, there's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that it's hereditary. So when you see someone having Efori Tuulu no man pe in traditional, in Yoruba, if a child is having Efori Tuulu, for instance, they will say, ṣé màmá ẹ̀ máa ń ní? Ṣé ta ló máa ń ní ní ìdílé wọn? Which means that traditional healers are also aware that it is hereditary. Wọ́n fi ń jogún ni. So when someone is beginning to have migraine headache, there are things that there are some preparations that we use. They will say they should dig the ground and wash the head into, and these things are actually effective. They are actually effective, especially with the soaps. They will wash the head, maybe leave the soap on the head, the thing will relieve. But basically, management, like you said, it is management. It's possible for someone who normally has migraine to avoid migraine for many years. How? You avoid the triggers. There are triggers for migraine.
Yeah, okay, that will take me to what are even the major causes of migraine.
Apart from the fact, I mentioned that it's hereditary. So there are some people who would always get migraine. Now, in the past, migraine was thought to be something that affected women alone. So they called it menstrual headache. In the past, that was historical, but eventually they found out that men also have it. So of course, men don't menstruate, and they knew that this was beyond just menstrual headache. Now, if you look at it, the fact that they called it menstrual headache meant that women got this kind of very severe headache towards their period. And we know that towards women period, there is a lot of stress on the body. There is hormonal, anomaly going on. And then, of course, the body is subjected to this situation for someone who already has the gene to predispose them to migraine. Now, some of the things that we have seen that triggers migraine in people who suffer from migraine: skipping meals. That is a major trigger. You see some people, they will say, oh, they are fasting, they are doing this. I'm not saying that people should not fast, but you should know yourself. If you are someone who suffers migraine, don't starve your body to the point that your brain will be deprived of sugar and migraine will be triggered. Because basically, headache is a physiological issue that is caused by chemicals and neurons in the brain. So it has everything to do with our environment, the things we put in our mouth. If you don't eat enough food, and at any point your brain becomes depleted of sufficient sugar or oxygen, migraine will be triggered. This we've also found that certain foods also trigger migraine, especially this reddish, this xanthosylum rich foods, like foods that are rich in red pigmentation, things like tomatoes, like pepper and stuff like that. We have realized that it also triggers migraine in some people. But of course, when you know yourself, there are ways that you can still eat this food and still manage migraine. You know that you should sleep, you should have enough sleep. Sleep deprivation is also something. It's not only migraine that it even triggers, it triggers headache generally. The adult is meant to have at least 7 hours of sleep. That is at least. If you can do 8 hours of sleep, fantastic. Now, in 24 hours, you see some people don't even get 3 hours of sleep.
Well, what could be that could be another topic, because insomnia, people suffering from sleep.
No, it's not even insomnia, it's stress. Imagine a city like Lagos, a city like New York, a city like all these major metropolitan. Exactly. Exactly. So the thing is, people don't get to sleep. In Lagos, for instance, you are up by 4 a.m. trying to get to work. You don't get to work until like 10 a.m. You can't get back to your home until 1 a.m. So you have less than 3 hours to even refresh and, So at the end of the day, there is this cumulative effect that the lack of sleep is going to have on your body. Because the human body is basically like a very complicated machine, just like our Android phones. But the difference between the phone and our bodies is that the phone, once the battery is drained, it will shut down. You need to recharge it. But how will the human body shut down? It starts to signal you with headaches, but many of us do not even understand this signal. So we keep going despite the fact that our batteries are so drained, it needs recharging.
So at every point, it's quite efficient for us to know that migraine is something that we can actually manage and
Exactly.
not uh, involved in things that can actually trigger it
That can
also.
trigger it.
And
Or you
you've
minimize
made
those
mention
things.
of our diet, you've made mention of the activities that we are into
Yeah.
that might lead us to lack sleep. And you've also talked about the third one that you talked about also, that one should, it could be
Stress.
hereditary
Exactly. It could be
also.
hereditary. Yes.
Now, having identified that it could be hereditary,
Another thing I would love to mention is the fact that a lot of people suffer headaches due to noise pollution in our society. It is in fact it's a major issue that government needs to pay attention. Some people will say, oh, government, what can the government do? The first thing government can do is regulate noise pollution. How can the government regulate noise pollution? Through taxation, through punitive
but
measures.
with what we're having in the nation, there are some noise that cannot be regulated.
What
From the
kind of
one that
noise?
our generators are bringing out, that one is there. We get to
It
drive.
can There is nothing that can be regulated. The government can decide that anybody with generators on after 12 midnight will pay a certain amount of tax. They are not telling you don't put your generators on, but it's your choice. If you are willing to pay that money, then leave
No,
your generator.
that is if
That
the
is going
government has
to
been responsive
that is
to our
that
plights
is the problem. The
initially.
government, that is why I said when we say government has a lot to do, government can determine the quality of air we breathe. And that is why we usually, sorry to chip this in, that's why we usually tell people everybody needs to get involved in governance. You can't just say it's not your business,
Because it's also
because
part of our health also.
government can regulate the emission of cars. They can decide to tax you if your carbon emission is up to a certain level, so they can determine the purity of the air that we breathe. They can determine if we get these headaches or not. They can determine if we sleep enough. Imagine a personal experience now. I had a client who had high blood pressure, and I gave him something to sleep. He had not been sleeping for months, and I gave him something to sleep, and the old man called me around 5:30, and he was like, doctor, I couldn't sleep. What happened? He said the religious center beside his house, they had night vigil all night. No, how do you relate that? We cannot say religious people should not have their activities, but at the same time we need to be considerate. For instance, it's absurd to have religious centers with loudspeakers beside the hospital. This is town planning issue. I mean, we have people who need rest in hospital, and you are putting a speaker directed to the window of someone who has high blood pressure.
So no wonder we have 1.5 million cases that are
I'm
being
sure
reported
that that is not
yearly.
even, it would be more than that. It would run into several millions. Unfortunately, in this society, we don't really keep
Well,
figures.
having identified the major predisposing factors of migraine, headache, how can we actually get to treat ourselves? So once we've identified this,
One thing I do personally for myself that I also recommend to people is that you need to have hair plugs. There is something they call hair plugs, because unfortunately the government is not helping with noise. So once the noise begin, you can plug your hairs. If you are someone who is predisposed to migraine, make sure that you avoid the triggers, which is skipping of meals, which is loud noise, which is unnecessary stress. Make sure you, at least, even if you can get 8 hours of 8 continuous hours of sleep, you can have them broken. You can have 4 hours at a point,
for
4 hours
hours.
later. Just make sure that you are recharging your battery sufficiently. And then in this part of the world, we don't appreciate what we call vacation. Vacation is not a luxury. It's like you saying charging your phone is a luxury. Vacation is, the time you get to recharge your batteries. We need to understand what vacation does to our body. It could extend our lifespan.
I think
So,
vacation helps to also maintain our mental health and how
exactly.
we get to actually manage.
Incidentally, depression is also one of the things that lead to headache. When we see people who suffer headache a lot, there is a high chance that they are depressed. So depression is one of the things that leads to headache as well. So the foods you eat, if you are someone who drinks a lot, you'll find out that you'll be suffering a lot. If you are drinking a lot of alcohol and you're not sleeping enough, you would get headaches. Your body will cry to you. It will cry out for help. And then it's also good to rehydrate. when we have headache, because we have found out that secondary headache can be caused by something like fever and dehydration, it will lead to headache. So you find out that when you rehydrate, it helps to relieve headache. In fact, most of the time, personally, if I feel headache, I just drink a lot of water. I make sure that my room is dark. I plug my ears and I try to sleep. Even if I don't have active sleep, I try to, pretend like I'm sleeping. And before I know it, I feel better without using any drugs.
Without using any drugs.
Yeah.
But earlier you made mention of what our forefathers used to use, probably wash the head inside the hole,
Yeah.
or inside,
Or in the river.
in the river, or even on the streets.
Yes.
Because I've heard it that if someone that is having migraine has just washed his head on the major
Someone else
junction,
must not cross it.
cross it.
And that is why it is unethical traditionally to wash head of someone with Efori Tuulu in a public place where someone else can cross. That would just be deliberately trying to harm another person. That is not an ethical traditional practice. That's why we have them digging holes and you cover up
It's again.
whatever you have washed, the hole as soon as you're done. That's the appropriate thing. Some people wash it in rivers, but I think for me, I observe these things, I document all these reports. For me, digging of the hole is the most effective. The river is also effective, but it's the safest, for other people around. Because you might think someone else will work on it. It could be your own child that will work on the
You should have some
head that you
herbs
wash.
that one can actually use when it comes to the treatment or management of
Headache.
migraine.
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, we have these herbs, these plants, sorry, Momodica carantia, ejinrin. I'm sure our people will know it. I'm sure our people, it's usually very bitter. Some people also use it to manage blood sugar, but it needs to be used under close clinical monitoring because it could drop blood sugar so much that it becomes an issue again. So what you just want to do is make a sponge out of this and use it to wash your head. You could do this in your bathroom. You don't need to wash it on the on the floor anywhere. And funny enough, it lathers when you like use it to make sponge. So you don't even need to put soap. So just use it to wash the head. And then another practice traditionally is that people who suffer Efori Tuulu, migraine, they are usually advised to cut their hair. So even if they are women, they are usually advised to be on low cut so that anytime they have the migraine, it's easy for them to, wash the head and stuff like that. But the best way to manage it is to avoid the triggers. I've seen people who suffer migraine who don't have episodes in 3-4 years because they are managing their condition.
They know the factors that might predispose them to
exactly,
it.
and they avoid it.
There is this plant or herb that I see by your side also. I don't know what it could be used for.
Okay, we also have the Oriata. Oriata, that's Xanthoxylum. It's used for chewing stick in many cases because it has antibacterial effect. And traditionally, the powder of Oriata, when chewed or just put in the mouth, because of the stingy effect, it helps to relieve the headache feeling. So for someone who has migraine or who has whether mild or severe headache, no matter the degree of headache, you can just put it maybe in the corner of your mouth and just sleep with it. Just make sure you are well rehydrated because using the herbs is not enough. For instance, if you are a Lagosian and you think that using ejinrin, the Momodica, will now prevent headache and you can go without sleep for 3 days. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to use these things holistically. While you are using the plants that work, make sure you are getting enough sleep as well. Make sure you are avoiding the triggers. If you live beside a church or a mosque, make sure you have hair plugs that you can use to, reduce the noise that is affecting your eardrums. Because every time sound hits our ears, the eardrum is active. And for migraine, people who suffer migraine, they will tell you every sound feels like there's a hammer going on in their brain. So
it's not just about taking herbs.
It's not just about taking herbs.
Care for ourselves. It's also a lifestyle that we need to start to imbibe in our day-to-day.
Absolutely.
On this juncture that we have actually got to, what is a parting shot for people as regards the management, the prevention, and keeping a healthy lifestyle as regards avoiding migraine?
I have said this before. I will always say it. I would always advocate for lifestyle adjustment. So please, if you are someone who suffers headaches that won't go away even after using, the common drugs or using all of those methods that we have recommended, please do not hesitate to go see your doctor. because we have noticed that people who suffer high blood pressure and suddenly slump had history of headache a few days before they slumped. People will say, oh, they said they were feeling headache, but because they ignored that message their body was sending to them, it ends up like that. People who suffer diabetes, whether it's whether it's hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia, they have reported that they also suffered a bit of headache. So anytime you are feeling headaches, don't just assume that swallowing painkillers will solve the problem. The painkillers are just steroids. They will just block off that feeling of pain. It doesn't take away the problem. So if you have high blood pressure, using painkiller will not take the high blood pressure away. If you have low blood sugar, taking painkillers will not take that away. And that's why it is important for you to go to your healthcare giver so that they can do a holistic diagnosis and take care of the primary problem causing the headache. Please always pay attention
It's
to your
actually
body.
been a wonderful time with you on the program today. We've been able to actually pinpoint a whole lot of things as regards how we can manage migraine. And you said something that is major to healthy living, that anytime we are having headache, our body is communicating something to us, and we need to actually take that signal effectively. Well, we've been speaking with Mrs. Christiana Olapade Ojo, the managing director of NAL Specialist Clinic Ibadan. It's good to have you on the program. We appreciate your wealth of knowledge being given to the viewers. Thank
I'm
you so
honored.
much.
Thank you for having me.
Well, till next week, when you'll be joining us on another edition of African Complementary and Alternative Medicine Africam. I am Oluwaseun Oyebade, and have a pleasant day.